There is nothing more interesting than formidable and powerful queens in history. The Starz TV show, The Serpent Queen Season 1, introduced us to one such queen, Catherine de' Medici, the Italian merchant's daughter who became Queen of France and wielded significant political influence during a time of religious strife and political upheaval. Season 2 of the show expands its royal cast to include Elizabeth I, England's monarch whose rule paralleled that of Catherine de' Medici, with both female sovereigns alternately serving as allies, indirectly reinforcing each other's reigns, or as formidable rivals facing overlapping struggles and triumphs. Imagine these two women as worthy adversaries battling it out across the chessboard of 16th-century European politics. Their weapons are not swords and cannons but intrigue, diplomacy, and cunning. This podcast delves into the annals of history to explore exactly how these two formidable queens compared to one another in their quest for supremacy in a male-dominated world. We'll examine their strengths, weaknesses, and the strategies they employed to maintain their grip on power, starting with two very different paths to queendom. Elizabeth's journey to the throne was perilous and uncertain. As Henry VIII's daughter by Anne Boleyn, her legitimacy was questioned from birth. She was declared illegitimate after her mother's execution, only to be reinstated later in the line of succession. During her Catholic half-sister Mary I's reign, Elizabeth faced suspicion and imprisonment due to her Protestant faith. It was only after Mary's death in 1558 that Elizabeth, at 25, ascended to the throne as queen regnant in her own right. Catherine de' Medici's path to power differed significantly. Married at 14 to the future Henry II of France, her position was initially precarious due to her inability to produce an heir for a decade and her husband's relationship with his mistress. Catherine's influence grew after she bore children, but her real power came after Henry's death in 1559. As mother to the young kings Francis II and then Charles IX, she became a central political figure acting as regent. Unlike Elizabeth, who ruled in her own right, Catherine exercised power through her sons, maneuvering within a system that didn't officially allow for female rulers. Next we have religion, power, and compromise. As Elizabeth and Catherine settled into their roles as rulers, they quickly realized that religion would be the defining challenge of their reigns. The Protestant Reformation had unleashed forces that threatened to tear apart the fabric of European society, and both queens found themselves at the center of this storm. Elizabeth, raised a Protestant but forced to outwardly conform to Catholicism during her sister Mary's reign, took a pragmatic approach. In 1559, she established the Church of England as a middle way between Catholicism and more radical Protestant factions. This was a masterful political move, aimed at creating religious stability in a deeply divided nation. Elizabeth famously declared that she had no desire to make windows into men's souls, meaning that she preferred outward conformity to Inquisition into someone's personal beliefs. Across the Channel, Catherine faced an even more volatile religious landscape. A devout Catholic herself, she found France increasingly torn between Catholics and the French Protestants known as Huguenots. The French Wars of Religion erupted in 1562, plunging the country into decades of brutal conflict. Catherine, ever the pragmatist, attempted to mediate between the warring factions. She arranged the marriage of her Catholic daughter Margaret to the Protestant Henry of Navarre in 1572, hoping to bring peace through this union of faiths. But Catherine's hopes for reconciliation were shattered in the infamous St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572. What began as isolated violence against Huguenot leaders in Paris spiraled into widespread slaughter across France. While Catherine's exact role in instigating the violence remains debated, the massacre forever tarnished her reputation and deepened the religious divide in France. Elizabeth, meanwhile, faced her own religious crises. Her excommunication by Pope Pius V in 1570 heightened tensions with Catholic power, particularly that of Spain. Yet Elizabeth skillfully used this threat to rally English patriotism, presenting herself as a bulwark against foreign Catholic intervention. As the years passed, both queens found themselves forced to take harsher stances against religious dissenters. Elizabeth's government cracked down on both Catholic recusants and radical Puritans who refused to conform to the Church of England. In France, Catherine alternated between attempts at reconciliation and harsh repression of Huguenots, depending on the political winds of the moment. The religious policies of Elizabeth and Catherine reveal much about their personalities and governing styles. Elizabeth's consistent, moderate approach provided a stability that allowed England to prosper culturally and economically during her reign. Her ability to create a public image of herself as a unifying figure for all English people, regardless of their private beliefs, was a masterful political achievement. Catherine's more reactive policy, while less successful in maintaining peace, demonstrated her adaptability in the face of rapidly changing circumstances. Her willingness to shift alliances and tactics in pursuit of preserving royal authority showcased both her political acumen and the precariousness of the French monarchy's position. As their reigns progressed, both queens came to understand that religious policy was inseparable from political power. Their handling of religious issues shaped not only the spiritual landscape of their realms but also their own authority and legitimacy as rulers. In navigating these treacherous waters, Elizabeth and Catherine demonstrated the complex challenges faced by female rulers in a time of religious upheaval and the political skill required to maintain power in such turbulent times. Which brings us to diplomacy and international relations. As Elizabeth and Catherine solidified their positions at home, they turned their attention to the complex web of European diplomacy. Both queens proved to be skilled players on this grand chessboard, using a combination of charm, cunning, and calculated risk-taking to advance their interests. Elizabeth's approach to diplomacy was marked by her famous tendency to delay and equivocate, particularly when it came to marriage negotiations. From the early years of her reign, she entertained suitors from various European royal houses, including Catherine's son, the Duke of Anjou. This dance of diplomacy allowed Elizabeth to maintain England's independence while keeping potential allies interested and enemies at bay. In 1570, when Pope Pius V excommunicated Elizabeth, she found herself in a precarious position. Catholic powers, particularly Spain, now had religious justification for military action against England. Elizabeth's response was masterful. She cultivated an image of herself as a defender of Protestantism, rallying English patriotism against the threat of foreign invasion. At the same time, she pragmatically maintained diplomatic channels with those same Catholic powers when it suited England's interests. In France, Catherine de' Medici was orchestrating her own diplomatic maneuvers. As the mother of several children, she had more pieces to move on the chessboard of European alliances. She sought to maintain French influence by proposing marriages between her children and various European royals, including Elizabeth. One of Catherine's most significant diplomatic moves was the marriage of her daughter Margaret to Henry of Navarre in 1572. This union was intended to bring peace between Catholics and Huguenots in France. However, instead it led to the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, a diplomatic disaster that damaged France's international standing, particularly with Protestant nations. Both queens had to navigate the looming threat posed by Spain, the dominant power in Europe at the time. Elizabeth's strategy involved supporting Protestant rebels in the Spanish Netherlands, a move that infuriated Philip II of Spain. Catherine, despite being Catholic, also saw Spain as a threat to French interests. She carefully balanced France's Catholic identity with the need to prevent Spanish dominance, sometimes supporting Protestant factions in other countries to weaken Spain's position. A key point of contention between Elizabeth and Catherine was the matter of Mary, Queen of Scots. As an aside, I'll mention here that Season 2 of The Serpent Queen dramatizes this conflict in an interesting way. Even though it truly was a particularly intense situation, Elizabeth I never traveled to France. You might get the impression that the two rival queens met in person, but they did not. Rather, they corresponded via letters and diplomatic channels, as was the norm. In truth, Elizabeth I was known for never leaving England during her entire reign. Returning to real history, Mary, who was Catherine's daughter-in-law and Elizabeth's cousin, posed a significant threat to Elizabeth's reign as a Catholic claimant to the English throne. Catherine supported Mary's claim, seeing it as an opportunity to expand French influence in the British Isles. Elizabeth, in turn, saw Mary as a constant threat to her rule. The handling of the Mary, Queen of Scots situation showcases the different diplomatic styles of the two queens. Catherine's support for Mary was overt and aligned with French interests. Elizabeth, on the other hand, kept Mary under house arrest for years, reluctant to take decisive action against an anointed queen. It was only in 1587, after numerous plots against her life, that Elizabeth finally agreed to Mary's execution. Both queens also engaged in covert diplomacy and espionage. Elizabeth's spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham, ran an extensive intelligence network across Europe. This allowed Elizabeth to stay informed of plots against her and to manipulate events to England's advantage. Catherine, too, was known for her network of informants and her skillful use of information to maintain her power. The culmination of Elizabeth's diplomatic and military challenges came with the Spanish Armada in 1588. Her famous speech at Tilbury, where she declared, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king," exemplifies how she used her gender in diplomacy and rallying her people. The defeat of the Armada was a diplomatic as well as military triumph, cementing Elizabeth's status as a national icon and strengthening England's position on the international stage. As their reigns progressed, Elizabeth emerged as the more cautious and strategic diplomatic player. Her ability to delay decisions and keep multiple options open served England well in maintaining its independence and growing its power. Catherine, while equally intelligent and politically savvy, often had to react to rapidly changing circumstances within France, making her diplomacy sometimes appear more erratic. Yet both queens demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability in their diplomatic endeavors. They each navigated complex webs of alliances, religious conflicts, and dynastic politics with skill and determination. Their rivalry not only played out through diplomatic channels, but they also engaged in a less visible but equally important battle for cultural influence and public adoration. Both queens understood the power of imagery and patronage in shaping public opinion and cementing their legacies. Elizabeth, the Gloriana of England, cultivated an image of herself as a semi-divine figure, the Virgin Queen married to her country. Her court became a center of literary and artistic flowering, producing some of the greatest works of the English Renaissance. William Shakespeare, Edmund Spenser, and Christopher Marlowe all thrived under Elizabeth's reign, with their works often containing subtle and sometimes not so subtle flattery of the Queen. In 1588, Elizabeth made a pivotal appearance before her troops at Tilbury, dressed in armor atop a white horse. This carefully stage-managed event, coming just before the defeat of the Spanish Armada, became an iconic moment in English history. It perfectly encapsulated Elizabeth's ability to present herself as both a warrior queen and a maternal figure to her people. Elizabeth's portraits were carefully controlled to present an image of ageless beauty and regal power. Even as she aged, her official portraits continued to depict her as the youthful Virgin Queen adorned with symbols of purity and sovereignty. The rainbow portrait painted when Elizabeth was in her 60s shows her eternally youthful, wearing a dress covered in eyes and ears to symbolize her all-seeing, all-hearing governance. On the opposite shore, the French queen was equally adept at using culture and imagery to bolster her position. As a Medici, Catherine brought Italian Renaissance influences to the French court, patronizing great artists and architects. The Tuileries Palace in Paris was one of her most significant architectural projects, designed to rival the great palaces of Italy. Catherine was also known for her elaborate court festivals and intricately designed dances, which served both as entertainment and as political theater. These spectacles, often allegorical in nature, were crafted to reinforce royal authority and showcase the wealth and sophistication of the French court. The Magnificences of 1565, a 2-year tour through France, was a particularly grand display of royal power and cultural refinement. Both queens were avid collectors of art and patrons of music. Elizabeth's court saw the flourishing of English madrigals and consort music, while Catherine brought Italian musicians to France and encouraged the development of French opera. However, the two queens' public images diverged significantly. Elizabeth successfully maintained her image as the Virgin Queen throughout her reign. using her unmarried status as a symbol of her dedication to England. This image of purity and constancy served her well, particularly in contrast to the turbulent personal lives of other European monarchs. Catherine, on the other hand, struggled more with her public image. As a foreign-born queen in France, she was often viewed with suspicion. Her reputation suffered greatly after the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, with many seeing her as a scheming Italian who had brought discord to their homeland. In response, Catherine redoubled her efforts at cultural patronage, seeking to present herself as a wise and cultured ruler working for the good of France. Both queens also used fashion as a tool of statecraft. Elizabeth's elaborate gowns and jewels became symbols of England's growing wealth and power. Her style was widely imitated throughout Europe, making England a fashion leader for the first time. Catherine, drawing on her Italian background, introduced new styles to the French court, including the high starched collar that became her signature look. As their reigns progressed, the cultural legacies of Elizabeth and Catherine took different paths. Elizabeth became an almost mythical figure in English culture as the good Queen Bess, whose reign was looked back on as a golden age. Her image as the Virgin Queen married to her country became a powerful symbol of national unity and purpose. Catherine's legacy was more complex. While her cultural patronage had a lasting impact on French art and architecture, her personal reputation remained contentious. However, her influence on French court culture, particularly in terms of etiquette and ceremony, would shape European royal courts for generations. In the end, both Elizabeth and Catherine demonstrated a keen understanding of the power of culture and imagery in shaping public opinion and securing their rule. Their rival courts became centers of artistic and literary production, leaving a cultural legacy that far outlasted their political achievements. Through their patronage and careful cultivation of their public images, these two remarkable women succeeded in securing their positions in 16th-century royal courts, thereby allowing them to significantly influence the political, cultural, and religious directions of England and France respectively. This brings us to personal relationships and court politics. The personal lives and court dynamics of Elizabeth I and Catherine de' Medici offer a fascinating study in contrasts, reflecting their different personalities and the unique challenges they faced as female rulers in the 16th century. Elizabeth, famously known as the Virgin Queen, made the radical decision to never marry. This choice, while politically advantageous, came at a personal cost. Her closest relationships were with her male advisors, particularly Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. Their relationship was the subject of much speculation and scandal, though Elizabeth never allowed it to compromise her rule. She once declared, "I will have here but one mistress and no master." It was a statement that encapsulated her approach to both personal relationships and governance. Elizabeth's court was a hotbed of intrigue and competition for the Queen's favor. She skillfully played her courtiers against each other, ensuring that no single faction gained too much power. The Cecil faction, led by William Cecil, later Lord Burleigh, and his son Robert, was counterbalanced by the influence of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, in the later years of her reign. Elizabeth's ability to maintain this delicate balance was crucial to her long and stable regime. On the other hand, Catherine de' Medici's personal life was markedly different. Married at 14 to the future Henry II of France, she endured years of childlessness and the humiliation of her husband's very public affair with Diane de Poitiers. When Henry died in 1559, Catherine emerged from the shadows, determined to secure her son's inheritance and her own power. As Queen Mother, Catherine's relationships were primarily focused on her children. She was fiercely protective of them, sometimes to a fault. Her determination to see her sons rule France led her to make alliances and decisions that were not always in the best interest of the country. The complex web of marriages she arranged for her children was designed to expand French influence across Europe, but also reflected her deep personal investment in her family's power. Catherine's court was no less intrigue-filled than Elizabeth's, but she took a more hands-on approach to managing it. She maintained a group of beautiful young noblewomen known as her flying squadron, who she used to gather information and influence male courtiers. This approach, while effective, contributed to her reputation for manipulation and scheming. Both queens faced challenges from powerful noble families. Elizabeth had to contend with the ambitions of the Dudley and Howard families, among others. Her handling of the Northern Rebellion in 1569, led by the Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland, demonstrated her resolve in facing down threats to her authority. Catherine, meanwhile, struggled with the powerful Guise family, whose influence often threatened to overshadow that of the crown. The two queens' different approaches to personal relationships were reflected in their governing styles. Elizabeth cultivated an image of herself as married to England, using this to foster a sense of personal connection with her subjects. She was skilled at using her femininity as a political tool, flirting with ambassadors and playing potential suitors against each other to England's advantage. Catherine, on the other hand, wielded power more directly. As Queen Mother, she was often the de facto ruler of France, particularly during the reign of her young son Charles IX. Her approach was more overtly manipulative, using marriages, appointments, and sometimes force to maintain her family's grip on power. Both women faced criticism and slander related to their personal lives. Elizabeth was often accused of sexual impropriety, particularly in relation to her closeness with male favorites like Dudley and Essex. Catherine faced even harsher accusations, with rumors of incest and occult practices circulating widely. Both queens demonstrated remarkable resilience in the face of these attacks, refusing to let personal scandal undermine their authority. As they aged, both Elizabeth and Catherine faced the challenge of maintaining their influence in courts increasingly dominated by younger factions. Elizabeth's relationship with the much younger Earl of Essex became particularly problematic, eventually leading to his rebellion and execution in 1601. Catherine, in her later years, found herself increasingly sidelined by her son Henry III and the ascendant Guise faction. In the end, Elizabeth and Catherine's handling of personal relationships and court politics reflected their broader approaches to rule. Elizabeth's carefully cultivated image as the Virgin Queen allowed her to maintain an emotional connection with her subjects that persisted throughout her long reign, while Catherine's more direct and sometimes ruthless approach to power kept her at the center of French politics for decades and ultimately contributed to the instability that plagued France in the latter part of the 16th century. As we look back on the legacies of Elizabeth I and Catherine de' Medici, we can appreciate the rivalry between these two awesome women of the 16th century. They continue to fascinate us, as proven by the popularity of such shows as The Serpent Queen. Elizabeth and Catherine may have been rivals in life, but in death they stand together as two of the most remarkable and influential women of their age. Thanks for listening, and be sure to check out the many videos and podcasts that I have done covering the historical background behind the TV show The Serpent Queen.